This pattern has a lot of different pattern pieces both for the blouse and for the facing parts. Therefore, it's a good idea to keep them neat and tidy and know which ones are which because they look a lot alike. It's also a good idea to mark the wrong side of the fabric for the facing, so you're sure you're putting the insert facing on the wrong side of the facings where it should be. Your insert facing should have one side with glue on it, that is the right side, that should be facing up. Place your facing pieces on top of the insert facing so the glue is touching the wrong side of the facing. Bring it to the iron table. Iron the insert facing and the facing together without using any steam, just the heat. Cut the rest of the insert facing off, so it's only the insert facing that's glued to your facing that's left on the pattern piece. Make sure everything is nicely glued together. Now you have to bring all your pattern pieces to your zigzag or overlocker, as you have to zigzag or overlock all of your edges. There are 2 different ties to this shirt, so you will need 4 ties in total, 2 narrow ones and 2 wider ones. To make the tie you have to fold it in half so you have a middle line. Unfold the tie and fold the 2 long sides by 1 centimeter in, or 3/8 of an inch. Fold your tie again in the middle. And fold one of the short sides in by 1 centimeter, or 3/8 of an inch. Do the same procedure with the narrow ties. First fold it along the middle, fold it out, take the 2 sides in by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Then fold it in half again so you have all the edges nice and neat and they're not showing. And then 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch in the short end. Now you have to sew along the folded long edge and the short end. Sew with 0.3 centimeters or 1/8 inches. Now we have to sew the two front pieces together. Place front piece 1 and 2 in front of you with the right sides facing up. Now take front piece 2 and put it on top of front piece 1 with the right sides facing down. Make sure that the two notches they match each other and pin them together. Pin the rest of the pieces together along the seam line. Sew the two front pieces together from the shoulder seam and down to the bottom of the blouse. Use an iron to press the seam allowances toward front piece 2. And repeat the process for the other front piece as well as for the back pieces. It's the same procedure for the back pieces. Here place the two pattern pieces with the right sides facing up. Take back piece 2 and place it on top of back piece 1 with the right sides facing down. Match the notches together and the rest of the fabric in the seam allowance. And sew it all together from the shoulder to the bottom of the blouse. Again, use an iron to press the seam allowance toward back piece 2. Now we have to sew the shoulders together. Place your back piece with the right sides facing up and place the two front pieces on top of it with the right size facing down. Match the shoulder edges to each other and make sure that the princess seam in the front of the back pieces are also aligned and are matching, and sew the shoulder seams together. Press the seam allowance open and flat with an iron. Now we have to sew the side seam of the blouse. On the right side, when you're looking at the blouse, you have to place one of the white ties where the notch is. You have to position it so that the open end of the tie is sandwiched within the side seam between the front and the back piece. And you have to sew the sides together. Afterwards, press the seam allowance open flat with an iron. Turn the entire blouse with the right sides out. Now we have to sew the facing together. First, take your neck facing with the right size facing up and place the two front pieces on top with the right size facing down. Sew the pieces together at the shoulder seam and press the seam allowance open and flat with an iron. Now we have to sew the bottom facing together. Start by taking bottom facing back piece 1 and place it down in front of you. Now take bottom facing back piece 2 and place it on each side of your back piece 1. Now take bottom facing front piece 2 and place it on each side of the back piece 2. And lastly, take the bottom facing front piece 1 and place it on each side of the front piece 2. Sew all of these bottom facings together so you have one long bottom facing. Use an iron to open and press the seam allowance. Now we have to sew the bottom facing and the front facing together. This has to be done in a very sharp angle to create a nice finish on the facings inside of the blouse. Sew the two facing pieces together with 1 cm seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch and open the seam with an iron. Now we have to sew the facing onto the blouse. You've already turned your blouse the right sides out. Now you have to take your facing and place it with the right side inward toward the blouse. For the second white side, it has to be sandwiched in between the facing and the blouse. When looking at the blouse, it has to be sewn onto the left front piece. You have to insert the tie between the facing and the front piece at the tip of the front piece. Make sure that it's the open end of the tie that you position between the facing and the front piece so it's nice hidden. Make sure that the edges of the facing align with the edges of the blouse, and of course match the shoulder seams, corners and princess seams on the facing and the blouse, and pin this in place. Now take the narrow tie. It has to be sandwiched in between the front piece and the facing on the right side of the blouse when you're looking at it. Again, you have to insert the open end of the tie between the facing and the front piece at the tip of the front piece. Sew the two pieces together along the edge all the way around. Be careful where there are sharp corners. Here you can keep your needle down in the fabric and take your foot up so it's more easy to make sharp corners and turn it around just as we're showing here in the video. Now you have to trim the seam allowance by cutting small notches around the neckline and where the seam allowance curve in the blouse. Also, you have to trim off the corners of the seam allowance and be careful not to cut into the stitching itself. turn the facing to the inside of the blouse and press the edge flat with an iron. Now we have to sew the facing in place. The facing has to be sewn to the front piece from the right sides with a visible top stitch. Here it's a good idea to pin the top edge of the facing to the front side of the front piece, just to ensure that the facing doesn't fold or slip while you sew. You can either mark 8 centimeters or 3 1/4 inch from the bottom edge of the blouse on the right side with washable chart to create a guideline for sewing the facing. We also like to place a piece of tape 8 centimeters from the needle so you have a visible guideline for the edge of the blouse. Begin sewing from the very edge of the left front of the blouse when you're looking at it, and sew all the way around following your markings, the 8 centimeters or 3 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of the blouse. Finish the stitching right at the edge of the opposite front piece. Be careful to adjust your stitching according to the fabric's angle as you sew, just to ensure that the seam remains the same length from the bottom all the way around. Open the blouse up so you can access the inside of the seam. Here it has to be on the left side when you're looking at the blouse. Position the open end of the narrow tie at the notch and fold the open end of the tie 1 centimeter in, so you're placing it in the middle of the seam. Pin the tie in place. You can sew the tie in place from either the right side or the wrong side. Just be sure that you sew it right down the side seam so it's not visible from the right side. If your blouse is not going to have sleeves, then you need to sew in faces to the armhole to finish the edges. To make the armhole facing, you have to sew one armhole facing front and back piece together. And you have to make both ends meet at the shoulder and at the armhole seam. Open up the seam with an iron so it's ready to place on the blouse. Turn the blouse with the right sides out and place the facing on the outside of the blouse armhole with the right sides of the facing against the right side of the blouse. Be sure that the shoulder seams match each other and also the armhole seam. Sew the facing in place with 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Trim the seam allowance by making small notches in all areas where the seam curves. Turn the facing to the inside of the blouse and press the edge flat. We recommend that you sew the facing in place in the shoulder seam and in the armhole seam. And at last, just congratulate on your new blouse. We hope you share it on Instagram using the hashtag #PPWrap and tag us Puff and Pencil.